I want to welcome you all here this evening. My name is Howard Steele. I'm a professor in the psychology department and a chair for the clinical psychology faculty. And I want to welcome all of you here. It's no secret that Jeremy Safran was my first cousin. When Miriam and I were recruited by Jeremy to work at the New School 16 years ago or so, this was a fact he disguised. But as a consequence, I know the Safran and Hunter family very well, and it's very special to see Kathy here, and Jenny, and Ellie, and Abby, who's about to sit down, and the family. And I want to take a few moments to introduce this evening. This evening is the first annual Jeremy Safran Memorial Lecture that we're so pleased that Nancy McWilliams has agreed to give. I'm going to say a few words, introduce Adrian Harris, and Adrian will introduce Nancy. I'm wearing blue tonight, blue jacket, blue shirt, blue trousers, jeans, and I did so thinking of Jeremy. Jeremy's often was seen with a blue cardigan or a blue t-shirt, and blue is an interesting color. And here I owe a debt to an Australian storyteller and artist, Hannah Gadsby. And I mention that because that would be something I would tell Jeremy. He was frequently telling Miriam and myself about one or other Netflix show to watch. He had this passion about everything he did. And blue, coming back to that, blue is an unusual color because it's not, it could never be used in the traffic light system. You know, red is clear. Stop, pay attention. This evening is going to be an amazing talk from Nancy, who is a hot property on the psychoanalytic calendar. If you go to her website, you'll see she's giving many talks all year round, especially in the spring and summer. So we're very grateful that she's here. Blue is not like yellow. Yellow is like pause, get ready, there's a transition coming. And there's so many transitions in our lives. And, you know, the Hunter Safran family has been through a year of major transitions and losses. And so for them, the green light is welcome. We're going forward. We're going forward into a new year that will bring new opportunities. Blue, Miriam said to me this morning, she's feeling blue. She's feeling sad today. Blue signals sadness. Blue also signals cold, icy blue. But a flame, we know that the hottest part of the flame is the blue part. And also we know that blue signals, like the green looking into the year ahead, there are blue skies ahead. It's a sign of optimism and hope. And this kind of paradox I'm pointing to with the color blue is something that would have appealed to Jeremy. His mind could contain any number of paradoxes and contradictions, and also delight in the mystery of this world, the mystery that took Jeremy from us a year ago today out of the blue. And so we think of his enormous emotional and mental capacities that are an inspiration, have been an inspiration to his students, many of whom are here, alumni of the clinical psychology program, current students. And with that, I want to say a few words about one of Jeremy's major initiatives going back at least a decade. And that was to establish the Sándor, or Sándor, as Kathy would say. He was Hungarian, Sándor Ferenczi Center. Ferenczi was one of Freud's contemporaries who was brave in taking seriously the actual events in childhood and adult life, the adversity, the loss, the trauma that impacts us all. And Ferenczi signaled the a kind of light that shone across the 20th century, that led to the development of object relations theory in all its variations, and then relational psychoanalysis. So 10 years ago, with Adrian Harris and Lou Aaron, Jeremy Safran started the Sandor Ferenczi Center to sponsor talks and learning opportunities around the work of Ferenczi, and to, in Jeremy's mind, help secure the future of both clinical psychology and psychoanalysis. Adrian is a brave soul. She carries the torch of the Sandor Ferenczi Center now without Jeremy and without Lou, who did not expect to live longer than Jeremy. He passed away earlier in the year from a cancer that he battled for a long time, and Jeremy was a good friend to him through that process. But here at the new school, Miriam Steele has stepped forward and joined with Adrian. Dr. Jennifer Hunter, Jenny's on the board of the Sandor Ferenczi Center, and a number of other people who have signaled their determination to make the Sandor Ferenczi Center a living group, a living learning society, opportunity to sponsor conferences. And so it's the Sandor Ferenczi Center with the clinical psychology group at the New School that is sponsoring tonight's talk, and Adrian is going to introduce Nancy. Thank you.
Thank you, Howard. I would never have imagined standing here on my own to introduce this lecture without Jeremy Safran and without Lou Aaron. But I feel enormous gratitude for Miriam Steele's joining me, and for other people on the board, Jenny Hunter, Alexandra Wagner, others. And we are very much determined that the Ferenczi Center will be a place for psychodynamic thinking, for psychoanalytic work of all kinds, radical, progressive, traditional. And this tonight is the first annual Jeremy Safran Memorial Lecture. And I think we are all very mindful, and I want to say to Jenny and family, we're holding you in our hearts and minds tonight and going forward. I want to find a bright way to segue into something brighter, and in fact, I can do so because I think Miriam and Howard and I feel incredibly, luckily, magically lucky that we invited Nancy McWilliams to be the first annual Jeremy Safran lecturer, and I feel we're off to a great start. Nancy McWilliams teaches at Rutgers University's Graduate School of Applied and Professional Psychology. She has a private practice in Lambertville, New Jersey. She's the author of Psychoanalytic Diagnosis, Psychoanalytic Case Formulation, and Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy, all with Guilford Press. She has edited or contributed to other books, is associate editor of the Psychodynamic Diagnostic Manual. I think what is true for, I'm sure, all of the clinicians in this audience, that whether you were young and in training or seasoned, Nancy McWilliams' books have been extraordinarily generative. They're books students love, people love, they use. They are incredibly foundational texts. And I think that's important because Nancy McWilliams is a foundational thinker in psychoanalysis, and so, I believe, was Jeremy Safran. So I feel the pairing of these two is going to be particularly wonderful. Dr. McWilliams is an honorary member of the American Psychoanalytic Association, the Moscow Psychoanalytic Society, the Institute for Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy of Turin in Italy, and the Warsaw Scientific Association for Psychodynamic Psychotherapy. And her writing has been translated into 20 languages. So she has an international reputation and following, and she contributes to psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic theory and psychoanalytic clinical theory in an absolutely international, worldwide way. The title of her talk is The Future of Psychoanalysis, Preserving Jeremy Safran's Integrative Vision. Thank you, Dr. McWilliams.
Thank you, Adrian, for that very generous and touching introduction. I feel honored to have been asked by Adrian Harris and the late Lou Aaron to give the first of these annual talks in recognition of the life and work of Jeremy Safran. I hope to do justice to his memory on this anniversary of the day he was so catastrophically taken from us. Jeremy was a unique voice in our field. He synthesized research and practice, academic and non-academic roles, immersion in both spiritual wisdom and secular sensibilities, respect for both traditional and contemporary psychoanalytic perspectives, and devout commitment to both work and family. More than all other listeners tonight, I hope his wife Jenny and daughter Ellie will feel I've honored all the roles that Jeremy integrated so gracefully. Jeremy was a clinician, a supervisor, a teacher, a writer, a husband, a father, a respected and beloved colleague. Jenny was just telling me that she honored him by calling attention to the fact that he was a questioner who always had to find his own answers, a resistor of orthodoxy, a seeker of wisdom, and a polymath in psychoanalytic theories, albeit a modest one. If psychoanalysis is to survive and evolve, it behooves the field to make the kinds of integration that Jeremy did as an individual. This talk will examine our professional present and future, encompassing three conceptualizations of the term psychoanalysis: as a specific type of treatment, as a knowledge base, and as an ethos, with emphasis on the last. First, what do we mean by psychoanalysis? Most narrowly, the word refers to a particular type of treatment. Although Sigmund Freud defined psychoanalytic technique in different ways at different times, certain understandings of psychoanalysis as a therapy assume a fairly rigid protocol. In mid-century America, ego psychologists depicted psychoanalysis in terms of the patient coming almost daily, using the couch, and speaking freely in the context of the analyst's neutrality, abstinence, and relative anonymity. The analyst's activity in this model is limited to encouraging free association and exploring the meaning of resistances to it, especially as they arise in the patient's transference reactions. Most people outside the analytic community have this image of psychoanalysis, hence all the New Yorker cartoons. To differentiate more flexible analytic treatments from this so-called classical analysis, some have distinguished between psychoanalytic and psychodynamic. Contemporary analysts tend to be more flexible, to work face-to-face and often less frequently, and to define psychoanalysis as a treatment in terms of a deep, mutual, emotional investigation. The older image of the reserved analyst behind the couch, however, is how most critics of psychoanalysis use the term when they argue that analysis is unduly expensive, too depriving for most patients, and suitable only for healthier people anyway. To them, our field is defined by a particular set of technical procedures that most of us see as long outdated. The second use of the term refers to a body of knowledge, that's the NPAP library, that has emerged from psychoanalytically oriented clinical investigation and related empirical research and has been understood via psychoanalytic theories of maturation, conflict, defense, personality, intersubjectivity, and other areas in which unconscious processes are foundational. In parallel to Freud's intellectual development, it is an evolving, often self-correcting corpus. Our collective and ongoing psychodynamic erudition is vast. It has been relevant to, among many other topics, psychopathology, individual differences, attachment, development, emotion, neuroscience, trauma, cognition, relationship, internal and interpersonal change processes, group and organizational dynamics, culture, politics, the law, and the arts. At a third level of abstraction, there is a psychoanalytic ethos that I believe requires our attention and conservation. As it has evolved over 120 years, psychoanalysis has embraced cardinal beliefs, attitudes, and values strikingly at odds with many assumptions that suffuse contemporary, technologically advanced, market-driven Western cultures. The psychoanalytic sensibility involves curiosity and awe, respect for complexity, disciplined empathy, the valuing of subjectivity and affect, appreciation of attachment, and a deep faith in devoted therapeutic collaboration. Although none of us can stand fully outside our own culture, psychoanalytic subcultures have functioned as a kind of alternative sensibility to the consumeristic, technocratic, mobile, mass culture that surrounds us in this era of dizzying change. Let me talk one by one about the present and future of all three of these meanings of psychoanalysis. First, traditional psychoanalytic technique. Although in some countries, generally wealthy ones, long-term high-frequency analytic treatment may be supported for individuals diagnosed with personality disorders, it is rare in today's world for intensive psychoanalytic work to be funded by either governments or insurance companies. Consequently, in-depth treatment is available only to people of a certain level of wealth or to those lucky enough to live in cities with low-cost analytic clinics. In the United States, some artists and other markedly introspective people also seek personal analysis and make significant sacrifices to undergo it. To accommodate such highly motivated individuals, many of us see some patients at low fees. In addition, candidates at analytic institutes who may be attracted to the depth and range of a tradition that can help them conduct all kinds of treatment seek personal analysis as the core element of their training, whether or not they intend eventually to practice psychoanalysis. Finally, people with deep internalized problems may seek or be referred to psychoanalysis because all other treatment approaches have failed. In some parts of the world, such as urban China and many Eastern European countries where psychoanalysis is creating excitement after decades of being devalued or even banned by political authorities, newly affluent young people are flocking to analysis with the same zeal that many older Western professionals remember from our early days in the profession. In other places, such as some South American countries, psychoanalysis continues to be appreciated and respected popularly, although again, its clinical base may be limited to wealthier people. The bad news about the current situation for almost all regions is that psychoanalysis as an open-ended intensive treatment will probably not survive inside most healthcare systems. The good news is that it will probably not die. In China, for example, there are now 7 IPA-approved training analysts, a minuscule few among China's millions, but we have seen before how psychoanalysis can spread exponentially, eventually evolving into a critical mass that becomes a nourishing professional community. I hope that what therapists are being taught in areas where psychoanalysis is currently and excitedly valued or rediscovered, such as East and South Asia and Eastern Europe, it is not so authoritarian and ideologically rigid that they later become disillusioned and rejecting toward the whole analytic tradition, as has happened to many former enthusiasts in the United States. Our history attests, alas, to the attractiveness of recurrently turning psychoanalytic exploration into technical fundamentalism. In most places, psychoanalysis will continue to exist at the margins, as has often been its fate. Analysis helps people in a profound, far-reaching way that other therapies rarely can. Those lucky enough to get intensive analytic treatment know how much they've been helped, and they will continue to spread the word. Publicly visible beneficiaries of very long-term psychoanalytic treatments, such as Oliver Sacks and Bruce Springsteen, may expedite this process. Poster children for psychoanalysis. In addition, institutes can be expected to keep insisting that candidates have intensive long-term analyses and that they see a certain number of patients in such arrangements, irrespective of how costly it may be for both analysand and analyst to meet this training criterion. Our analytic educational system guarantees a certain consumer base, even as institutes have mounting challenges. To attract candidates, many now offer 1 or 2 year courses in shorter term and less intensive psychodynamic therapies. In addition to trying to be useful to therapists struggling within current healthcare constraints, they hope that once students see the value of thinking psychoanalytically, they will continue on for full analytic training. What some of my more cynical colleagues have called a bait and switch strategy seems to be working so far. There will always be those for whom psychodynamic ideas simply make sense, who fall in love with our ways of understanding self and others, who are motivated enough to pursue a thoroughgoing exposure to analytic influence. There may even be an upside to the current devaluation of psychoanalysis by the general mental health community. In an earlier era, when being an analyst was a ticket to lucrative employment and prestige, our discipline attracted many who were motivated more by self-serving ambition than by deep resonance to analytic ideas. Now, our institutes tend to attract candidates with a deep feeling for the work. They want analytic training, even though it is a professional disadvantage to be seen as psychoanalytic. Because they come with less undergraduate and graduate exposure to psychoanalytic ideas, they require us to start at a more basic level of training, but they have the heart for what we do. Second, psychoanalysis as a body of knowledge. I've been greatly worried about the loss to current and future clinicians of vital, clinically precious psychoanalytic knowledge. During their graduate training, fewer and fewer mental health professionals are exposed to seminal analytic writings. My beginning graduate students at Rutgers now know almost nothing about early developmental phases, defenses, and levels or types of personality structure, and even the psychoanalytic concepts of transference, countertransference, and resistance are new to many of them. At the same time, perhaps it is somewhat consoling, in addition to being quite irritating, I would say, that psychoanalysis is being perpetually reinvented by people of other orientations. As the cognitive behavioral movement matures and begins recognizing the same phenomena that analysts have explored and formulated in psychodynamic terms, basic psychoanalytic knowledge is being rediscovered, renamed, and expropriated. Robert Bornstein has been trying for years to get the analytic community to see how its ideas are being hijacked. Despite efforts of CBT-oriented professionals not to use psychoanalytic language, they continue to coin concepts that parallel our own. For example, what we see as projection, they call cognitive bias. What we call unconscious, they term implicit or out of awareness, and so on. The upside of this process is that everyone who wants to help people with mental suffering is looking at the same human animal and is likely eventually to discover similar conceptualizations and ways of coping with clinical challenges. Much of my own work in recent decades has involved an effort to preserve and disseminate psychoanalytic knowledge, especially clinical knowledge. For example, my collaboration first with Stanley Greenspan and Robert Wallerstein, and then with Vittorio Lingiardi, in both editions of the Psychodynamic Diagnostic Manual, reflects this concern. In these volumes, we tried to make readers of all theoretical orientations aware of the long-established biopsychosocial clinical tradition that views suffering dimensionally as well as categorically, is attentive to idiopathic as well as nomothetic understandings, is oriented toward finding meaning in symptoms, and construes psychological problems as at least partly a response to personal context and life events, all areas close to the heart of Jeremy Safran. We have established from the royalties of PDM2 a fund to support psychoanalytically oriented research that will be of real value to therapists. Just last month, we awarded 3 grants for $15,000 and 1 for $8,000 to psychodynamic researchers. Governments, insurers, and pharmaceutical corporations all have pressing financial interests in reducing the intensity and length of psychotherapy and defining it as short-term symptom reduction. In Great Britain, for example, there's been a movement to educate therapists only in so-called modules. It is much cheaper to train people in time-limited bits than in extensive postgraduate programs. A clinician might be certified, say, to do anger management, but not grief counseling. The combined political influence of those trying to cut costs at all costs drowns out the voices of seasoned practitioners. Clinicians who protest anti-psychoanalytic decisions may be accused of inflexibility, self-serving bias, and resistance to scientific progress. We are told we are not respecting the evidence defined in ways that suits the interests of the powerful to save money at any social cost. Despite our recurrent efforts to exert influence in such critical areas as the promulgation of treatment guidelines, the promotion of manuals, and the accreditation of training programs, the American Psychological Association cannot seem to stop colluding in this process. The amount of sheer misinformation APA leaders are willing to endorse in the service of pandering to the powerful is staggering. For years, I have heard academic colleagues, not all of them ill-intentioned, opining that it is, quotes, unethical to conduct psychodynamic therapy for conditions for which a short-term so-called evidence-based treatment exists, and that is whether or not such treatments have been empirically found to be very effective. There just has to be a research on them. State licensing exams are now falling in line. Some of you have probably seen the documentary Leaving Neverland. You think those 2 men who were seduced by Michael Jackson could have resolved their PTSD quickly via the APA guidelines for the manualized treatment of trauma? Psychotherapy itself is being redefined, whereas we and the general public once viewed therapy in terms of a healing relationship within which a clinician might call on a range of interventions, we now are urged to view it in terms of specific technical approaches represented by geometrically multiplying acronyms to be taught via manuals. APA leaders are now framing therapy training in terms of developing performance skills, as in musical or athletic achievement. They recently asked me to create a manual of graduated exercises in psychodynamic therapy. We are urged to practice such skills systematically and apply them authoritatively to discrete DSM-defined symptom patterns. We are being pushed to be technicians, not healers of the soul. Even the norm of therapy for the therapist is disappearing. Many of my students have been told by a psychology professor that there's no need for them to go into treatment unless they have a DSM disorder. Now, I've depressed you. That is the bad news, of which most of you are keenly aware already. The good news about the survival of our psychoanalytic knowledge base includes a few bright lights in a dim field. There is, for example, thriving research on attachment, the theoretical baby of the psychoanalyst John Bowlby, operationalized by his protege, Mary Ainsworth. In Great Britain, Peter Fonagy has almost single-handedly preserved psychoanalytic therapy by rooting his clinical recommendations in attachment research. Mario McWilliams in Israel and Philip Shaver in the United States have connected their research on attachment to numerous clinical topics. Analytically oriented investigations into early childhood relationships like those of Edward Tronick, Beatrice Beebe, Miriam and Howard Steele, Norca Malberg, Carlin Lyons-Ruth, and Ariana Slade, among many others, continue to have an impact. Whoops, I skipped a couple of these. There's Peter Fonagy's work, Shaver and McWilliams, the Steeles. There are contemporary researchers such as Phoebe Kramer and Christopher Perry who study defenses, and some like Steve Huprick and Bryn Grenier persist in the empirical exploration of concepts relevant to personality styles and disorders. There are also scientists studying specific psychoanalytic treatments for particular problems. Barbara Milrod's group has done this with disorders of depression and anxiety. Otto Kernberg and his colleagues have done so with respect to personality pathology. Diana Fosha, Alana Bass, and others have researched shorter, emotionally intensive analytic treatments. These studies hold their own statistically against any of the much touted CBT approaches so widely claimed to be the only scientifically supported therapies. Jonathan Shedler has made an internationally respected argument that psychodynamic therapies are as evidence-based as any other treatments. Fortunately, there continue to be a few intrepid young scholars who insist on pursuing psychoanalytically informed research, and there is a flourishing listserv of psychoanalytic researchers who help them and each other to conduct it. Contemporary neuroscience has supported many analytic constructs that were once more hypothetical by locating in the brain the processes that analysts previously had to talk about in metaphors. The Nobel laureate Eric Kandel has more than once publicly stated that psychoanalysis is the only adequately comprehensive theory of mental functioning. In Australia, Russell Mears has developed a self-psychologically oriented treatment for borderline conditions grounded in understanding of the brain processes involved in trauma. Scholars such as Mark Solms, Alan Shore, Richard Cheffetz, and the late Jaak Panksepp have identified areas in which groundbreaking neuroscience supports many analytic inferences about affect, memory, cognition, desire, addiction, trauma, and other mental phenomena. Research on therapy outcome conducted by psychoanalytic, humanistic, and cognitive behavioral scientists continues to show that interpersonal factors contribute to treatment success much more than type of therapy. Personality and relationship, the two emphases of the psychoanalytic literature on treatment, have been empirically shown to matter much more to the outcome of any kind of intervention than the theoretical orientation of the therapist. The critical therapeutic role of the alliance, originally investigated by Safran and Moran in a groundbreaking series of studies in the late 1990s, continues to be empirically demonstrated. Even the APA acknowledges this reality, despite the fact that so many APA leaders operate in ongoing defiance of their own official statements to that effect. The relational movement has excited many clinicians, intellectuals, and humanitarians, drawing people around the world to the analytic community. The relational turn has attracted a raft of younger people uncomfortable with their grandfather's psychoanalysis. That movement continues to mature, inviting its members towards self-reflection and self-criticism. There's a couple of recent self-critical books. Third-wave feminist, intersectional, queer theory, and anti-racist movements that appreciate the power of unconscious processes are speaking to the next generation of clinicians who viscerally know that therapy involves more than skills training or courses in cultural competence. And politically, There is finally enough alarm in the clinical community about the devaluation and destruction of psychoanalytic knowledge that we are organizing as we did in the 1980s when we protested the exclusion of non-physicians from the Institutes of the American Psychoanalytic Association. The American Psychological Association will shortly face its own accreditation process with the Department of Education, making it potentially more accountable to articulate criticisms. Bryant Welch is starting to frame APA's position on training as tantamount to consumer fraud. Some of us are starting to call this GAP 2.0. You old-timers will remember what that means. Finally, there is a kind of psychoanalytic survival in the psychotherapy integration movement. The increasing influence of the Society for the Exploration of Psychotherapy Integration, SEPI, founded by highly respected academic psychologists, attests to general interest in synthesizing psychoanalytic ideas with those of other orientations and in making research more relevant to actual clinical needs. With roots in the work of the analyst Paul Wachtel and the earlier synthesizers Dollard and Miller, this movement attests to the continuation of psychodynamic ideas in still unexplored ways. Third, the psychoanalytic ethos. Core psychoanalytic values include self-understanding, authenticity, empathy and compassion, egalitarianism, adaptation to unchangeable realities, growth in agency and personal responsibility, the acceptance of normal dependency, and respect for others as subjects rather than objects. Michael Guy Thompson notes that because of the centrality of an ethic of honesty in the Freudian project, psychoanalysis is inherently subversive of its surrounding culture. In insisting that we try to tell the truth about sexuality, aggression, dependency, narcissism, and other features of human nature that the post-Victorians found less than seemly, Freud exposed some hypocrisies and conceits of his era and culture. Whatever his own blind spots, he set a tone for the attempt to get beyond individual and cultural illusions into territories that are unsettling, humbling, and undermining of the pieties and complacencies of both scientific and popular habits of mind. Ultimately, he related the project of trying to be honest to the relief of psychological suffering, associating truth with freedom in an ancient equation. In several ways, present-day North American mass culture is a threat to the psychoanalytic ethos. Interestingly, psychoanalysis was an unusual movement to be embraced by Americans who tend to be attracted to simpler, more pragmatic, and sometimes utopian ideas. The United States was founded on a radical Lockean metapsychology that assumed unlimited resources, boundless potentials, the inevitability of progress, and a confidence that all problems can be solved with common sense and individual ingenuity. One way of framing the divergence of the psychoanalytic tradition from mainstream Western cultural influences is that most Americans subscribe to a version of the comic rather than the tragic vision of human life, the pursuit of happiness rather than the graceful adaptation to inevitable pain. In 1984, Stanley Messer and Meyer Winokur made a helpful distinction in comic versus tragic terms in the literary sense between the mindset of psychologists from the American behavioral tradition on the one hand and that of European-influenced psychoanalytic thinkers on the other. In the comic narrative, limits are challenged and overcome, and complex difficulties resolve themselves in the end. People live happily ever after. Give us a symptom, we'll find a technique to fix it. In the tragic narrative, we inevitably suffer, but our suffering has meaning, and through it, we learn and grow. And we explore the paradox and mystery that Howard Steele alluded to. This is much closer to Jeremy Safran's Buddhist sensibility. During and after World War II, North America was the beneficiary of some brilliant refugees, not only in psychoanalysis, but in the sciences, humanities, arts, and social sciences. The analysts among these immigrants brought a European mindset to our clinical intellectual life that lasted for more than a generation. That group has mostly died off now, leaving the United States to its prior, less nuanced habits of thought. Psychoanalysis is now an older discipline. The United States is a young, some would say adolescent, society, originally defined by our rebellion against older European norms. We crave the latest thing and disparage more ancient sensibilities. When psychoanalysis was the latest thing, many Americans embraced it with uncritical enthusiasm, claiming too much for it, treating competing ideas contemptuously, and making inevitable the disillusionment that followed. Now that psychoanalysis is no longer new, now that its quirkier ideas have been debunked and its better ones have been absorbed into the body of knowledge we consider common sense rather than psychoanalytic revelation, many have relegated Freud's cherished movement to the scrap heap of ancient and failed ideologies. Few contemporary publishers are interested in psychoanalytic books. Academic departments of medicine, psychology, and social work are rapidly replacing psychoanalytic scholars with intellectuals of other theoretical orientations. Psychoanalytically oriented graduate programs, internship sites, and postgraduate fellowships are now rare. Whether or not psychoanalysis ever regains widespread respect as a scholarly theoretical discipline, there is a larger question of whether the general psychotherapeutic sensibility that the psychoanalytic movement set in motion will be similarly devalued. If it is, the life work of most of us is at risk. Let me talk specifically about the whole area of wisdom, with apologies to the few of you who may have been to my talk in Toronto several years ago for APA. I was trying to chide them about their collusion with torture. Much of our psychoanalytic knowledge and practice is more expressive of communally shared clinical wisdom than of the accumulation of data. To keep the psychoanalytic ethos alive, we need to save an appreciation of wisdom in an era when we are all inundated not by wise reflection, but by information. All our recent technical and scientific innovations have so far proven insufficient to preserve a civil political discourse and solve together some glaring human problems, including the survival of the planet. We need urgently to be wise, not just smart. In 2007, Cynthia Baum-Baker launched for Division 39 what we came to call the Wisdom Project. Her idea was to do a kind of clinical oral history, to devote time to open-ended interviews with psychoanalytic wise elders. She solicited names of individuals acclaimed for their clinical wisdom, not necessarily famous analysts, but those who were sought out as analysts, or supervisors. Interestingly, when she researched the phrase clinical wisdom, she found almost nothing in the psychology literature. Then she spent many hours with 18 of these individuals, asking them to reflect on their careers, their satisfaction and disappointments, the lessons of their long years of experience and practice, and their advice to the next generation. Some of what I'm about to say about wisdom is based on her content analysis of her conversations with these professionals, then in their 70s, 80s, and 90s. Some will reflect my own reflections on how wisdom differs from both intelligence and knowledge, and on how professional organizations in our age of technologically driven consumerist mass culture may, to our detriment, tilt problematically toward valuing intellectual brilliance and knowledge of specific information over wisdom. As a good psychologist, let me start with the empirical literature. Robert Sternberg, who has studied wisdom for years, views it as the value-laden application of tacit knowledge not only for one's own benefit, but also for the benefit of others in order to attain a common good. The wise person realizes that what matters is not just knowledge or the intellectual skills one applies to this knowledge, but how the knowledge is used. According to Sternberg, wisdom differs from knowledge, involves a sense of balance, and is integrally connected with what Plato would have called simply the good. The Berlin Wisdom Project is another major empirical effort, which concluded that wisdom is a complex construct with several interpenetrating elements. Here are the 7 characteristics that Paul Batras of that project identified in a cultural historical analysis. You can see you can't define wisdom very simply. Schickment, Mihaly, and Rathunda studied Sternberg's work along with wisdom texts from the Bible to current philosophers, concluding that what typifies the wise include the abilities to contextualize information, understand the limits of what is known, be aware of ambiguities and moderating conditions, and get at the deeper meanings beyond superficial appearances. They note that wisdom is a concept used to define mental activity that is directed by values and emotion. Adding that, the limitations of reason have been well understood since ancient times, as any high school debater learns, depending on the premises chosen and what evidence is suppressed or advanced. Diametrically opposite conclusions can be reached logically from the same array of facts. The concept of wisdom is usually defined in contrast with overly narrow perspectives on rationality. Psychological scholars thus seem to agree that there cannot be wisdom in the absence of introspection, judgment, and a valued subjective life. Such work belongs in a long tradition of trying to put words around what contemplative human beings, philosophers, social scientists, mystics, poets, judges, theologians, and others have struggled to articulate over centuries. The great religious traditions, both Western and Eastern, are often referred to as wisdom traditions. Despite their differences, they have certain shared beliefs about the good life. Perhaps, as Karen Armstrong has suggested, the most universally endorsed core value of the major spiritual and cultural wisdom traditions is compassion, surely a central therapeutic value. But those traditions also try to articulate wisdom, emphasizing mainly humility, openness to learning, and acceptance of human limitation. I am not alone in viewing psychoanalysis as a secular wisdom tradition. Over the decades, it has indeed come to emphasize humility, the attitude of not knowing, and the acceptance of painful realities about what is possible for human beings. Dr. Baum-Baker found that, unprompted by her interviewees mentioned certain common themes spontaneously: openness to experience, capacity to tolerate uncertainty and paradox, sensitivity to complexity, respect for conventional rules coexisting with the willingness to challenge them, and a sense of balance between immersion in experience and critical reflection. Many noted the pivotal role of mental and emotional suffering in their own growth. These themes resonate with those of others who have tried to capture the nature of wisdom. Here are a few of them: Aeschylus, Sophocles, Confucius, from the Judeo-Christian Bible, from the Buddha, wear your ego like a loose-fitting garment. One more psychoanalytically relevant observation from a source less widely noted for wisdom. Knowledge speaks, but wisdom listens. I'm talking about wisdom because I think Jeremy Safran would have never claimed to be a font of wisdom, but I believe he was. When psychoanalysis was the dominant mental health paradigm, one way we failed the larger society involved a lack of humility and an overconfident overvaluation of what psychoanalysis can do. Although most analysts I know are far from arrogant, there have been enough self-important voices among us to alienate many outsiders from our ways of understanding both psychopathology and larger human issues. This has created an anti-psychoanalytic backlash that has cost us greatly, with which we are still dealing. From at least the time of Aristotle, who famously distinguished between knowledge and wisdom, both great thinkers and empirical scientists have differentiated between being smart and being wise. We all know people who are impressively bright whose behavior can show a terrible lack of wisdom. Therapists frequently deal with brilliant patients who just don't seem to get it about what is important in life and what is not, like the perplexed man in his 50s I interviewed a few years ago who complained, I don't know what I'm doing wrong. I have lots of money, 2 vacation homes, and a yacht. I'm friends with celebrities. I have had 4 beautiful wives. Why am I not feeling happy? A striking feature of wisdom is that we tend to experience it as received. We can't pursue it as we would pursue information or data. It comes to us from life experience. It accumulates as we learn lessons that are often painful. As analysts know well, Sophocles was right. It does come from suffering, especially from suffering witnessed by a caring other who can help us put words to the pain. Cultures differ in how they transmit wisdom, but usually it comes via stories. A few years ago, I visited New Zealand, where a Maori man talked with me about how the sensibility of the elders is passed down in his tribe. Most of their wisdom comes through myths, stories about ancestors, and fables about animals. Interestingly, as in many cultures, their symbol of wisdom is the owl. When I asked why, I was told that the owl inhabits the night and speaks for the dead. When he hoots, he is telling listeners that their dead ancestors, the wise ones, are still with them. When I spoke in New Zealand to an audience that included several Maori therapists, they wanted to know about my parents and my upbringing, because otherwise, how could they understand where I was coming from and evaluate what I was saying? A very different, more intimate sensibility than ours. Arnold Keyserling, a 20th century philosopher, was much concerned with the damage suffered by traditional cultures and their wisdom traditions under the onslaught of colonialism and the civilized culture's assumptions of superiority. I'll read this because it's kind of small. The scientific method created in the 15th century by the Neapolitan philosopher Talesius, the father of all the subservient academies of science, essentially means repeatable experiments verified by logic and mathematics and giving rise to heuristic theories replaced when necessary by new ones. This is an ideal paradigm for science, but the lack of a coherent theoretical frame of reference destroyed the basis of civilizations which existed before the 15th century. In the last 300 years of critical rationalism, from Newton to Mandelbrot, the incomplete paradigm of science led to the colonialist destruction of countless archaic civilizations. The scientific method is a precious achievement of our civilization, and I'm not attacking it here, but I am attacking the arrogance that it provides the only route to valuable understandings. Before we had it, civilization's survival depended on wisdom. The South Sea Islanders somehow managed to go vast distances in small crafts to read the stars, to know which plants to eat and which to avoid, which natural substances had medicinal properties. The anthropologist Wade Davis urges us to learn from indigenous cultures before they are destroyed, and we then have no wisdom to balance the knowledge conferred by the scientific method. In a kind of professional parallel to such processes, contemporary therapists feel we are being asked to accept what I think philosophers would call a category mistake. To do randomized controlled trials of alternative therapies, it is a research requirement to be highly specific about the problem to be studied, that is, to cherry pick subjects with the same uncomplicated disorder, that's what it usually means, to take objective measures of reportable symptoms at the beginning of treatment, to manualize what is done, that's a research requirement, to end the research after a certain number of sessions, both because of the limitations of one's grant and because of ongoing pressures to publish, and to judge progress by reduction of objectively measured symptoms reported at the beginning of the study. In contrast, therapists rarely see clients with one discrete disorder, not comorbid with anything else. We cannot isolate client variables. We often depend for our sense of a clinical baseline more on a discipline's subjectivity and clinical inference than on objective measures. We appreciate that clients cannot always articulate what ails them. We work from general principles and deviate as needed from manuals, which, as Paul Wachtel recently noted, we tend to call books. When possible, we let therapy come to a natural termination by mutual decision, and we judge improvement not only by symptom reduction, but also by changes in overall life satisfaction, attachment security, self and object constancy, authenticity, emotion tolerance and regulation, resilience, capacity to reflect on the self, capacity to mentalize others, flexibility of response to stress, realistically based self-esteem, vitality, acceptance of what cannot be changed, capacity for gratitude and forgiveness, and other aspects of general psychological wellness. Most clinicians agree that therapy should be based on research, and Jeremy Safran would have said this earnestly. But being based on research is different from being like research. I think we're under current pressures to define a patient's suffering via a single categorical label, to take objective measures based on self-report, to manualize what we do, to work in the shortest possible time frame, and to judge improvement by change in overt symptoms. But this constitutes the misapplication of a research paradigm to a clinical one. In other words, a category mistake. These demands that we therapists conduct our work as if it were like doing randomized controlled trials has been painfully burdensome, especially as insurance companies, politicians, and other potential funders of psychotherapy have picked up this formula. A related problem is that because scientists need to isolate variables, eliminating people with comorbidities from research samples, most investigations that meet criteria for evidence-based treatments have been conducted with those at the healthier end of the spectrum of any disorder category. Almost all the currently touted evidence-based treatments for DSM pathologies have studied patients with the least severe versions of a given syndrome. Such individuals are much more cooperative research subjects after all and have lower dropout rates from studies. More severely troubled patients in any symptom category tend to have comorbid personality disorders, post-traumatic conditions, and substance use disorders. The recent APA practice guidelines for working with trauma patients are heavily based on studies that eliminated participants with the severe, complex traumatic histories that we typically see. Urging therapists to use such empirically validated techniques on all patients in a given diagnostic category is dangerous. Clinicians who employ them with their more deeply disturbed clients tend to fail, often concluding that some more talented or experienced practitioner could have made them work. Their demoralization can then prevent their learning what would actually help, and their patients may decide that therapy is ineffective. When, for example, severely obsessive-compulsive patients with psychotic-level personality structure are urged uncritically or too early into exposure paradigms, they tend to react with profound resistance, paranoid distrust, or deep feelings of failure. Psychoanalysts know a lot about helping complexly troubled people. Keeping alive our wisdom about that is central to the public interest. Psychoanalytic wisdom involves mature acceptance of unwelcome realities. Miracles of healing do not happen in a few weeks. Change in therapy involves not just behavioral and symptomatic alterations, but foundationally a coming to terms with things that cannot be changed. Analysts foster acceptance of limitation in trivial ways, such as offhand comments to patients like, "Yeah, I suspect your husband is never going to be very good at picking up after himself." And also in dramatically consequential ways, such as the frank admission to a multiply traumatized man that although he can look forward to having a good enough life, he will never again be the self he was before the traumas. Wisdom about limitation is an old emphasis in our tradition, going back at least to Freud's framing of maturation in terms of giving up the pleasure principle for the reality principle, or framing the goal of psychotherapy as replacing neurotic suffering with ordinary human unhappiness. As I have noted, his stance epitomizes a temperate, cautious, mature European intellectual perspective, greatly at odds with the more adolescent American sensibilities that are starting to dominate mental health approaches worldwide that can include a baseless optimism about, quote, doing more with less. Stephen Reisner recently lamented the commodification of the symptom, that is, conceptualizing mental distress as a commodity requiring elimination by a manualized treatment offered by a provider of that commodity. He notes that this way of construing suffering obliterates the possibility of seeing any larger meanings in it. Not exactly, the vision of the ancient Greeks, who venerated the constraints of time, fate, and acts of the gods, and ascribed the most painful life experiences to hubris, the human tendency to deny limitation. In therapy, we create a relationship in which clients can name their desires, rage about the gratifications they may have deserved but did not get, and bear a grief process that culminates in moving on to satisfactions that are possible, rather than staying frozen in either resentment or chronic victimhood. Freud framed mourning as work, to my mind, one of his most brilliant insights. The mourning labor is a kind of toil that we both resist and seek out when we engage in what he called working through. Martha Stark and others have gone so far as to say that psychoanalytic therapy itself is an extended process of grieving. The consumerism that has dominated American and then global economic life since the mid-20th century exploits our infantile tendencies to imagine unlimited gratifications. Public discourse is replete with the idea that getting what one wants or what one is entitled to, what one deserves, equates with life satisfaction. As a contrast with this American consumerist pathology, consider Epicurus' observation that suffering comes from wanting what you cannot have, and happiness from enjoying what you do have. Or the Japanese adage that true happiness is not getting what you want, but coming to want what you have. Not a naturally resonant observation to most Westerners, but not strange to most psychoanalysts, given what we witness again and again in our offices, as our clients become satisfied with their lives in direct proportion to their capacity to accept frustrating realities and appreciate available pleasures. Some implications for the future of psychoanalysis. What can we do to preserve the psychoanalytic tradition that so infused Jeremy Safran's work and is under attack from so many different directions? In terms of psychoanalysis as a clinical technique, there is great variation among different countries and cultures, but many, including ours, we need to accept that its continuation will probably be limited to therapists in training and a few highly motivated, introspectively curious, psychologically talented individuals with adequate financial resources. In terms of the second and third meanings, however, there are a few ways we may be able to keep alive both the psychoanalytic knowledge base and the psychoanalytic ethos. First, we need to challenge perceptions that psychoanalytic thinking is irrelevant to most mental health issues or is germane only to the problems of those who are psychologically and financially able to undertake classical psychoanalytic treatment. We need to keep raising questions about what is considered evidence. We should resist the reduction of all psychological suffering to narrow DSM or ICD categories and insist on talking about the whole person in each person's context. We must confront the desiccation and misunderstanding of science, insisting that it not be defined exclusively by statistical hypothesis testing, and that it include what Reichenbach called the context of discovery, that is, hypothesis generation, not just hypothesis testing. Second, we must become more involved with researchers, including telling our scientist colleagues the kinds of problems we actually struggle with and asking for their help in studying the issues that really matter to us. We need to educate them about the poverty of DSM definitions, the problems of cherry-picking clinical populations for research purposes, the limitations of symptom reduction as the criterion of psychological improvement. We need to emphasize the damage that can ensue when patients are told they have been given the best evidence-based treatment and then realize they are not better. How that situation discourages people from seeking mental health services and burns out therapists. Fortunately, there is a movement afoot among many clinically sophisticated researchers for practice-based evidence. That is, research like Jeremy Safran's based on real clinical experience that will start to counteract what many in CEPI have been calling empirical imperialism. It's a great phrase. Third, We need to get out of our offices and talk to mental health groups and interested organizations about the value of thinking psychoanalytically about the diverse problems they face. Helping other professionals with their difficult or incomprehensible patients is the most effective way I've found to convey the value of our tradition. We can let colleagues know how we might construe and approach their clinical problems, and we can recommend books and articles in our literature that may help them with therapeutic challenges. Rather than approaching them with the attitude, we have a lot to offer you, we need to approach them with requests in the nature of, what do you need that we might be able to help you with? When we have such conversations, we cannot be arrogant or disrespectful, as so many outside the psychoanalytic world expect analysts to be, and we cannot get defensive. We can explore with colleagues how the language we use often captures similar concepts to those that have arisen from their own epistemologies. We can be open to combining different approaches, refusing to reduce the discussion to an either-or competition. In a similar vein, we cannot spend all our energies fighting with other analysts over which psychoanalytic orientation is best. And even if we have strong feelings on the topics, we cannot get bogged down in what some have called the frequency wars and the furniture wars. That is, how many meetings a week should be the standard and whether analysis is really analysis without the couch. While we fight battles that the rest of the world sees as self-absorbed and arcane, life moves on without us. If we cannot embody psychoanalytic wisdom, we cannot expect others to be impressed by the psychoanalytic ethos of humility, curiosity, and openness to experience. We need to walk the walk. If I am typical of most analysts, we would rather do the collaborative work that we know reduces and prevents mental suffering, teach what we have learned to the next generation of healers, and continue ingesting ideas and absorbing wisdom relevant to our compelling vocation. We do not want to spend our time defending our techniques, our knowledge base, and our ethos. But as Jeremy Safran knew, the going-on being of our beloved profession may require that we do just that. Thank you.
I think if Jeremy were here, he'd be well pleased. I think that's what one could call a tour de force, and it's a great pleasure that I think we all had listening to your survey of many centuries of thought and concentrated reflection on what the psychoanalytic project can bring to all of us. So maybe it only remains for us to thank you again, and people can have, hopefully, a meaningful end to the evening. So thank you again.
Thank you.